So tonight we want to focus our attention on this Heart of Christianity study on the Bible, the scriptures that lie and support and serve as a foundation, really, of the whole sort of Christian identity, a book that we call the Bible. And I'm going to tell a very personal journey, just as I did last week when I talked about Jesus, rather than speaking about the Bible from an academic perspective or trying to describe it from a theological understanding, although those will come into play. I want to mostly just tell you a very personal story and then where I'm at right now and how I'm understanding it. And I also want to name some of the tensions with the scriptures in what's happening around us, within us in this contemporary context as well. Before I even begin to talk about the Bible, I was thinking about this week of how to start, and I want to start actually by talking about where all the controversy comes from and why there's so much heated conversation about the Bible and so much disagreement and really vehement disagreements about the Bible. And you see within the Christian community a broad range of understandings around the scriptures. Essentially, for me, the way I've been able to understand it, and the way I've been able then to talk to people that maybe disagree with me, or I disagree with them, or we maybe we all identify as Christian, but then we have this gap between us, is to really understand the issue of authority. Because I don't think if we understand authority, we really will get lost when we start talking about the Bible and not understand why there's such a big difference. If you kind of understand, I think, authority on a continuum, on one extreme, I would call it a deeply held belief in external authority or authority above. And I would say on the other end of the continuum, you have a belief in inner authority, or I would say authority among. And those are just ways of being in the world, of seeing yourself, of understanding yourself in community and context of your life. If it's authority that's external or above, or is provided in something that is authoritative and trustworthy, it can be, fixed in, say, a document. Like right now, the US election and all of the controversy going on. And whenever there's a need to kind of talk about authority, oftentimes the US Constitution is brought up, this document and set of documents. And then there's an interpretation of it, of course, which it really gets quite confusing. But the actual idea that there's a grounded, fixed, trustworthy document here called the Constitution. I just spent the last couple of years living and working in China. And in China, there is one official language, like one language, one nation, one people. This is the language of the Chinese government uses, and one party. And it really is the authority in the Chinese situation, it really lies in the party and the president of the party as a figurehead, but really the Communist Party itself is the unifying kind of authority within the community. We have to acknowledge the advantages that authority, external authority in one person, one party, one document provides. It gives you stability. It gives you an ability to minimize the kind of chaotic decision-making, because there's one vision, there's one voice that is dominant. And I kind of imagine it this way, that external authority is kind of like a big ocean liner, and it has a lot of inertia, and it kind of travels. But if you want to move it, you've got one person basically at the helm who can turn the rudder. And so, it will turn, but it's really kind of very slow moving that way. There's a lot of disadvantages, of course, with external authority, and there's huge disadvantages when we get to lack of freedom and oppression, the lack of a kind of a collective wisdom, because this one person or this elite make all the decisions. There's also this real strong desire for homogeneity, for kind of a oneness that is required and demanded, and a conformity then that sets into the group. So that's the one end, and the understanding of the Bible as external authority is very powerful in the Christian story for millennia. There's definitely large parts of the Christian church that have desired that, sometimes in the tradition or in a pope, in a particular figurehead, but oftentimes in the document of the scriptures itself. Now, internal authority, the other end of the continuum, that's the belief that there is a power within the community, a spirit, a social wisdom, and it lies in individuals within that group, but it also lies in the collective itself. And I've been heavily influenced by my mentor, Parker Palmer, who brought into my life, his understanding, his learning, and as a Quaker, as a society, in the Society of Friends, and that whole tradition where there's a lot of emphasis placed on the authority of the individual, and therefore good process, like good disciplined ways to have a conversation with one another and to reach an understanding together. I live in a housing cooperative where we make all our decisions by consensus. And one of the things we believe in the community here is that we don't vote on things, that we see voting as a form of violence. So we have to kind of all come to agreements. We're a small enough group where that's very possible to do that without too much pain and anguish, but we do hold it up as a value. And of course, that's the one advantage of internal authority, is that you get this ability to have the whole group involved in it. You've got this greater freedom and diversity because you're trusting everybody. The disadvantage is that it is a chaotic field. It borders on anarchy sometimes when you get into larger groups, especially, and it takes longer sometimes to make decisions, and you got to really involve everybody. And so when you approach the scriptures from a place of internal authority, then you have to get into an openness as you receive the tradition and you receive these words and these stories, to hold them lightly, to see their deeper meaning, to talk together about what you think it means, and to allow that to arise in a way that's natural, kind of organic, arising from the community. So I just wanted to name those because on the one hand, the external authority, you're going to get into literal understandings, and that's very important, that it be God spoke these words and people wrote them down. On the other end, you can have a very much a human book. This is a human product. It just came out of cultures, came out of communities, wrestling with spiritual questions, trying to use the best wisdom they had. But we are in the same boat. We're also trying to take these inherited stories and make some meaning out of them, and we're kind of caught up in it together. So I just wanted to name that at the beginning, because otherwise I think it creates confusion. I grew up very much in a tradition of external authority, and I'll call this the parachute Bible, because it was as a kid, it was kind of a magic realism, and as a kid, I just kind of, it just descended. The Bible did out of the sky, literally, or was whispered, direct words into someone's ears, and they just wrote them down, just like a stenographer. And it was the King James Version growing up, and that has 4 or 5 centuries now of tradition behind it in that English translation. So it seems like it's been around forever, and it seems like this is the way that God talks to the community, and in these very sort of a fixed tradition, and it's plain literal meaning is just obvious. The interpretation is not visible in a lot of times when we talk about the Bible as an authority or the literal word of God. The So that was my background, and I was in that tradition, learning how to read the Bible, taking it very seriously, reading it every day. Then I went off to study biblical studies and original languages and how to read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew. And I was very serious about trusting the authority of Scripture and therefore knowing the Bible really well. I even memorized entire books of the Bible because I was a Bible quizzer when I was a teenager. So we memorized like the book of Romans, word for word from beginning to end, and then we would get quizzed on it, and we had to jump off on these little seats with lights on them and stuff. And then the other thing that happens with the parachute Bible idea is that you also then get into construction of doctrine based on what we call proof texts. So you scan the Bible and you find different pieces that justify building and constructing the sort of doctrinal system. And because it's coming from the Bible, it's unquestioned, unchallenged. You can't question it. You can't push against it because it comes with the power of this external authority. Then I was 29 years old and I was a pastor, and none of it made sense to me anymore. And there was literally a morning that I woke up and asked myself, did I trust myself? Did I have integrity? Does it all have to be this, what seemed to me like a house of cards? And once I began to pull out a few of them, the whole thing collapsed on me. And then I found out that what I had thought was this, reliable, literal, trustworthy gift of God to the world in this actual sort of pure form was, it was just a bit of a mess, actually, to be honest, a bit of a mess. Discovering really that the Bible wasn't written in English was, and that it was translated. So what we have, and that there was a lot of controversy and question around some of the translations, and some words we don't even know how to translate because their fancy word is hapax legomena. They only appear once in history, and they appear once in this kind of biblical text, and no one knows exactly what it means because we can't compare it to anything else. We found out that the Bible is actually made of fragments and copies. We don't have a single original document that is in either Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic. There's a couple of sections of the Bible that are in Aramaic too. But we don't have anything. We have no originals. So we all have is copies. And we have a lot of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. We have a lot of those. We also found out that there's been a lot of corruption of the text. There's been insertion of new materials. Some of the stories are beautiful. I love the story in the Gospel of John where they've drugged this woman and they're going to stone her for what she's done. And Jesus enigmatically kneels down and does something in the dust with his finger. And then he says, if you haven't ever committed a sin, then you're free to throw a stone. And the group disperses, and then he liberates her from this situation, but also from her own sense of shame. It's a beautiful story. I love that story, but it got added in. It's not part of the original Gospel of John. It was inserted later on by someone who creatively found this story somewhere and included it in. There's a really weird set of stories at the end of the Gospel of Mark that weren't there in the original Gospel of Mark, or the older versions. I shouldn't even say the original because we don't know what the original was actually like, but we know the oldest ones we've got don't have this last bit, and they got added in later on. And it says you can handle poisonous snakes and you can drink poison. And I went to school in Kentucky, and there were churches up in the mountains in Appalachia that did that. They handled snakes and they drank poison, and because it's all there in the Gospel of Mark, but it wasn't there. And then all of a sudden it was there in just certain places where the gospel was being copied. So we know actually this happened all the time, everywhere. You get to a book like the book of the Revelation, the Apocalypse. It's it's terrible writing. Like whoever wrote it didn't know Greek very well, maybe a second language. Um, it's full of problems. So you get this sense then that the Bible comes to us with all of this really convoluted history, which is really quite fascinating. And then you know, dawned on me that, you know, along the way, that the Bible's not a book, it's a library. It's a collection of books. So we talk about it as though it's the Bible, but the Bible is just this collection. And it's 66 books, but it's even in some of those books, there's several sections, like a book like Isaiah. There's definitely some books within a book there. So it's not one long sermon that starts in Genesis and ends in Revelation, not one continuous flow. It's like a Netflix series. All right, that's the best thing I can describe it as. In which you're watching it and you're kind of saying to the person you're watching it with, is that, what was there a flashback just now? Like what happened just now? And who's that character and where do they fit in? And why did this episode start this way? It's just like that. And it sort of has a thematic container that holds it all together somehow, but it's full of these episodes and characters and different tenses, and it's confusing and complex. So this is, I think, a better way of actually seeing the reality of what the Bible is. And then you have also within the scriptures multiple perspectives. It's not uniform when it comes to even to the teaching in the Bible. You get a book like Joshua where God commands genocide, openly commands genocide to eradicate not just the soldiers in battle, but the women, the children, the livestock, everything. Then you go to a book like the book of Jonah, and in the book of Jonah, you have this radical story about the fact that everyone belongs. I was taught growing up that the prophet Jonah, he was sent to go preach to the people of Nineveh, this was the Assyrian people. And he was sent there and he was afraid to go. So he took off, but then he got swallowed by this fish and he got thrown up on the beach. So he comes into Nineveh smelling like fish puke, and he does his sermon and somehow convinces all the people. But when I actually read the book of Jonah for the first time, it was mind-blowing to me that he was a racist. It's a book about racism. Jonah hates these people. He hates them with a passion. And that's why he doesn't want to preach to them, because he doesn't want them to have a chance. And he knows that God is far more gracious and compassionate and open than he is. And he doesn't want to give God even a wedge. He doesn't want to give God any opportunity. But it ends up he gets stuck, and then he's resentful and hateful. Oh, it's not a pleasant book to watch Jonah in operation, because it exposes all of this deep othering of people, and those books are somehow held together in this collection. Another contrast I'll mention tonight is this whole teaching around blessing and prosperity. So you have books like Deuteronomy and Proverbs. There's a law in there about the fact if you're righteous and a good person, there's like instant karma. Like you basically, you're going to win the lottery. It's there, like just waiting to happen for you. And if you are not, you are going to suffer in this life. Then you get a book like the book of Job or Ecclesiastes, and they dismantle that prosperity teaching. They say that it's not, the life is full of ambiguity. If there is karma, where is it? It doesn't seem to be around, because the wicked are doing pretty good and the righteous are really suffering. And then you see all through the Hebrew poetry, the book of Psalms, these questions are back and forth. Is it about blessing and prosperity, or is it about abandonment and ridicule and humiliation? What is the lot of those who want to follow a life that's good? Anyhow, I could talk and talk and talk about all that tension. I just wanted to name a few of them. My mentor Parker, when I was in training with him as a facilitator, we got talking one time about truth, and I mentioned how much I really missed, I longed for the type of truth that I had when the Bible was this authority and everything was clear, and everything could be sort of constructed, and there was a reliable foundation to it all. And now it's kind of all broken loose. And then Parker said something to me, and then later on, I found it in some of his writing as well. But he said, Dan, truth is a conversation. And it's an eternal conversation about things that matter, conducted with passion and discipline. That's Parker's definition. Truth is an eternal conversation about things that matter, conducted with passion and discipline. Passion because we're involved in it, because this stuff matters, and discipline because we know how to have the conversation with one another. And it's been really helpful for me to see the scriptures in that way, that it is one place. And I think for a Christian, for myself, trying to follow the life of Jesus, and particularly the Gospels, but all of the scriptures for me, and more so over the years, the Hebrew scriptures, as well as I read people like Abraham Heschel, and understand a bit more about the prophetic tradition, opening that up, and then seeing Jesus in a different way as well. I just want to be part of that eternal conversation. I want to have it with the scriptures, with others. I'm going to close here, but I want to just introduce one more teaching that came to me from a wonderful teacher in the Hebrew scriptures named Walter Brueggemann. And it was a little book he wrote about preaching, and it always stuck with me. He said, when we approach the Bible as a preacher, you need to get the triangle right. Because if you don't get the triangle right, you'll be abusive and oppressive. The way we fail as preachers is when the triangle is upside down. And that's when there are 2 points in the triangle, 3 points in the triangle, sorry. The 3 points are the preacher, the Bible, and the people. So if the preacher and the Bible gang up together and they go at the people, and the preacher takes the Bible and uses it as a way to condemn or reprimand or judge, if they use the Bible in that way, and if they're on the side of the Bible, then the people suffer and the community suffers. So he said, when you preach, the preacher needs to get together with the people, because the Bible is fine on its own. It's resilient. It's been around, and it will be around. No one needs to defend the Bible. What you need to do is get on the side of the people, and you need to ask the questions. Does this make sense? This is offensive to me. This is raising all sorts of questions as I read this text. I don't know what this means. This can't possibly mean what it says. So let me give you an example. I was asked to read last Sunday in the service at the Kamloops United Church that was being streamed. And the text was from the Gospel of Matthew. And it was towards the end of the Gospel, and kind of a story that Jesus tells about the sheep and the goats and about judgment. I read it, and as I was reading it, I was both so appreciative of the reading, and I was so deeply offended by the reading, all in the same time. This idea in the story that when we clothe the naked, when we feed someone who's hungry, when we visit someone in prison, when we're responsive and caring, we're doing it not just to the person who's in front of us, but the story says we're doing it to Jesus. We're doing it to the divine and the sacred. We're doing it to life itself in those moments. So that's a beautiful insight. And then it's like, yeah, but if you don't, then you're like going to burn forever in eternal punishment with the devil and his angels. And that's the text. And I think, wow, like if there's ever a text that a preacher needs to get together with the people on, it's a text like that, because we need to talk about what this means, and how does that have authority? How is that both, how do we receive a text like that, hear it, don't dismiss it, but sit in its tension, sit in its confusion, or as Parker would say, have a good conversation about things that matter. In this case, how we live our lives and how we are compassionate to others, and have it with passion and discipline. Okay. All right. So that's it. I did want to maybe toss one more thing. Just when we get into this thing about, is the Bible true? And I am often asked that question, especially when people find out that I'm clergy and they want to know something about the Bible, and we get talking and they say, well, but is the Bible really true? And what we discover is that what they mean by that question is, did all this stuff happen? Is the Bible sort of a video transcript of actual events? And my comeback is always the same, as I've heard from amazing other biblical scholars and other people I've encountered. But also, I think just the what I encounter when I actually read the early sermons in the Jesus community, it's all metaphor, it's poetry, it's intended for effects. It's intended to stimulate and to evoke and to provoke and to bring up the whole human experience into view, so that we can really discover in the conversation. And that's why I've always been much more appreciative of Martin Luther's understanding that the Word of God is not pieces of paper and ink. It is the living communities wrestling with divine revelation, wrestling not, and that's not locked into the past. That's happening right in the present moment. And that's where the Word of God becomes alive, is when we're like tonight, we're all sitting, listening, probing, wondering, pondering. Okay. So thank you for allowing me to begin with this tonight, and then we'll transition. I'm just going to turn off the recording here.